I've got a question for you. Why are so many people obsessed with the past? Because everywhere you look today, people seemingly want to explain who they are based on something that happened yesterday. Colonialism, slavery, historical injustice, this concept of white privilege. And then in personal lives, childhood trauma, your parents, your ex, something that somebody said to you at work 20 years ago. Increasingly, we're encouraged not just to understand the past, but to build our whole identity on it, and then to carry it with us, to explain our failures through it, and sometimes even excuse our own behaviours because of it. And I personally think that's a massive mistake because, yeah, the past can explain where you've come from, it can explain some of your scars, and it can help you understand the way that you think and behave in certain circumstances, but it should not define where you're going to go in the future. Look at the arguments around colonialism. Essentially, we're split into two groups. One group should feel inherently guilty for stuff that happened generations before they were born, and the other group should remain victims in perpetuity because of stuff that happened generations before they were born. And it's the same with this idea of white privilege, as if every white person born in Britain, is automatically given the keys to Buckingham Palace. They've clearly not been to a very white, poverty-stricken area in Britain somewhere. And similarly, probably haven't been to Bradford and seen the amount of brand new Range Rovers blasting about. But seriously, I'm not saying that historical injustice didn't happen. Of course it did. But slavery has always existed. Nobody had a monopoly over it. Groups will always attempt to exert their will over others, and that's done either through alliances or dominance. Sometimes there'll be winners and sometimes there will be losers. But please don't think that in India, prior to the British arrival, it was all peace and light. It simply wasn't, and any basic reading of a historical document of that era will show you exactly how it was. But it's important to note the following. There is a huge difference between understanding history and being imprisoned by it. Because if conquest and historical injustice condemn a people to permanent victimhood, how did Britain ever become Britain? As we know, these islands were conquered by the Romans. They were invaded and settled by the Anglo-Saxons, as well as the Vikings. They were conquered by the Normans. Land was seized, people were killed, kingdoms disappeared and cultures changed. Yet the descendants of those people, us, didn't spend the next 1,000 years saying, we'll never be able to succeed because of what the Normans did to us. Eventually, our islands became one of the most powerful nations on earth and the centre of the largest empire in history. Now, we can debate the British Empire until the cows come home, because clearly there were achievements, there were injustices, and there was lots in between. But that's not my actual point. My point is this. History happened to us too. Our ancestors suffered invasions, wars, disease, poverty, exploitation and oppression. But eventually, history became something to learn from rather than an excuse not to move forward. And perhaps that's something we've forgotten. Because this video today is not really about colonialism anyway. It's about us and how many of us will carry pain from our past into our futures. I mean, look at relationships, for example. Somebody gets cheated on, and it's happened to many of us. We've been betrayed, we've been humiliated. Our hearts are ripped out of our chests, and you know what? It's horrific. But if you cannot release that person who did that to you in your past, you will carry it into every relationship that follows. You won't trust the person that you meet in your future because of the person in your past. You become jealous, emotionally unavailable, push people away and drink too much, sleep around, destroy potentially good relationships before they've even had a chance to develop. And then when somebody asks why, it's like, well, you don't understand what happened to me in my past. It's like, maybe I don't. Maybe what happened to you was really terrible, but eventually you have to ask yourself, how long does somebody else get to control your life after they've already departed from it? Because if somebody hurt you 10 years ago and you're still allowing what they did to determine how you treat people now, they're still controlling you. They're still living in your head. It's just that they're doing it from a distance. And the tragedy is that sometimes the person who eventually pays the price for that previous behaviour isn't even the person that hurt you. It's somebody who's come along with the purest of intentions and literally has got to pay the price for the inability to release the past. We understand this instinctively in almost every other area of life. Imagine a military commander who loses a battle. Bill Slimming in Burma in World War II. He could have spent the rest of the war talking about that defeat, or he could study it. What went wrong? What did the enemy understand that I didn't? Where was I weak? What assumptions did I get wrong? What will I do next time? And that's exactly what he did. He was pushed all the way back to India, but he was able to reconstitute his army, learn his lessons, and then go back and push the Japanese all the way back out of Burma. He adapted. That is what resilient people do. They turn defeat into victory. He didn't deny that he lost, but he studied why he lost. Because the purpose of yesterday's defeat is to help you win tomorrow's battle. And that's the difference. One person can say, this is what happened to me, therefore that's who I am. Whereas another person can say, yeah, this did happen to me. What can I learn from it? Same past, completely different future. See, I've had to deal with this myself. I left the military because I was diagnosed with permanent severe post-traumatic stress disorder. And believe me, there were reasons for it. War, Afghanistan, IEDs and friends being killed. Things that you can't unsee. But I could have took that diagnosis and built my entire identity around it. I could have said, well, that's me then. I'm damaged. This is why I can't do that or that or that. This is why I behave like this. And nobody could honestly say those experiences didn't affect me. Of course they did. But eventually I realised something. An explanation can very easily become an excuse. And I wasn't prepared to spend the rest of my life defined by the worst things that had happened to me in a small chapter of my life. So I had to take personal responsibility. Not responsibility for the bombs, not responsibility for people dying, not responsibility for everything that happened to me, but responsibility for how I chose to be after that fact. And there's an enormous difference because I couldn't change what had happened, but I could decide whether it was going to own the rest of my life or not. And this exact same principle applies to emotions. People are always going to upset you. They're going to insult you, reject you, betray you, disappoint you. People are going to say things that you don't like, and you have absolutely zero control over that. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't feel anything. Feel angry, feel frightened, feel hurt, grieve, cry, whatever. Emotions are real, and you can acknowledge them, understand them, and feel them, but then you have to decide what you're going to do. Because emotions are simply information. They're not instructions. Anger doesn't require revenge. Fear doesn't require retreat. Sadness doesn't require surrender. Jealousy doesn't give you ownership of another person. And pain doesn't require you to remain in pain forever. You don't have complete control over the first emotion that enters your head. But you have far more control over what happens next than we've been encouraged to believe. Perhaps one of the most dangerous stories that anybody can tell themselves is this. I am this way because of what happened to me. Because hidden inside that sentence is another belief. Therefore, I can't change. And that's where explanation becomes imprisonment. Maybe something terrible did happen to your ancestors. Maybe something terrible did happen to your parents, to you. Maybe you've been betrayed. Maybe you've been abused. Maybe you've been defeated. Maybe you've been diagnosed with something. And I'm not asking you to pretend that none of that happened. I'm asking something much more important, which is, well, what are you going to do about it now? Because eventually personal responsibility has to begin. Your ancestors can't live your life. Your parents can't live your life. Your ex can't live your life. Your trauma can't live your life. Your emotions cannot live your life. Only you can. And perhaps we've created a culture that's become so good at explaining why people are the way that they are that we've forgotten to tell them that they can become something different. That's not compassionate, because what could be more disempowering than telling somebody you are the product of things beyond, way beyond your control, and that's where the story ends? No. I mean, understand the past, learn the history, recognise injustice, understand your own personal wounds and grieve your losses. Remember the people that you've lost, and obviously get help where you need it. But don't worship those scars. Don't worship what happened in the past. Don't make them your identity. Don't carry yesterday around like a suitcase, weighing you down for the rest of your life. Because the past has already took whatever it's took from you. Don't voluntarily give it your future as well. Because you are not responsible for everything that happened to you. But eventually, you have to accept that you are responsible for everything that happens next. You know, the past explains the battlefield, but you still get to decide your next move. And maybe that's where personal responsibility really comes into play. Not pretending that nothing happened, not suppressing your emotions or denying injustice, but deciding what happened to me does not get the final say over who I become.